Hello, continuing on the endocrine system lecture, folks. This is a this is a negative feedback loop that shows you the relationships between the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary target glands, the target gland hormone, and the systemic effects. So recall that the hypothalamus, in this case, secretes releasing hormones, and then in response from the releasing hormone, the anterior pituitary then releases a specific hormone and then a stimulating hormone most of the time. And that stimulating hormone then stimulates a target gland, and that target gland secretes a hormone which then creates a lot of the desired systemic effects. Okay, so if we're gonna take an example, so again, this is a highly generic feedback loop, but if we take, let's say for instance, the testes, let's assume that this is the like in this case, HPG. HPG means the hypothalamus, pituitary, and the gonadal pathway. Gonadal meaning it targets the testes and the ovaries. What happens, folks, is the hypothalamus releases, in this case, releases gonadotropin releasing hormone, which in turn stimulates the anterior pituitary to secrete two hormones, follicle stimulating hormone FSH and luteinizing hormone LH. Okay, those two hormones in turn, what happens is then stimulates the testes for males or the ovaries for females. Okay, and those two then create, in this case, either testosterone or estrogen. Okay, and testosterone and estrogen has systemic effects. Obviously, the effects here for testosterone would be the increase in sperm production, the increase in male secondary sexual characteristics like increased muscle, okay, increased libido, increased aggression. Okay, there is a feedback loop. So if the amount, let's say for males, of testosterone is high enough, that goes back to the previous two organs and turns them off, right? So if you have high amounts of circulating testosterone, that high amounts of circulating testosterone turns off the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus from releasing, in this case, gonadotropin releasing hormone and the release of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Okay. Also here, you can see that there's a short loop feedback, which means to say that the anterior pituitary secreting, in this case, FSH and LH, in turn shuts off the hypothalamus from releasing gonadotropin releasing hormone. So all you have to think about is the downstream, this is downstream, this is upstream. The downstream hormone, the downstream organ always turns off the upstream organ or the upstream hormone. Okay. Also note that, let's say if you have high amounts of sperm and high amounts, or libido and aggression, that itself turns off the target gland, in this case, the testes. Okay. So this is again a highly generic negative feedback loop for most hormones. There is only one hormone that actually does not follow this, and because it's passively feedback regulated, and that's oxytocin. Okay, and for our purposes, we will not be concerned about that hormone for this lecture, but know how this negative feedback loop operates. Okay, so to be more specific, so this is the actual hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis. So we actually have two thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, triiodothyronine or tetraiodothyronine. And the effects of the thyroid hormone, folks, is the primary requirement, the primary effect, systemic effect of the thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, is increased metabolic rate. Increased metabolic rate means you're going to burn more calories. You're going to burn more glucose. You're going to make more ATP. Okay? So you're going to increase metabolism. You're going to increase metabolism by increased muscular skeletal contractions, muscular skeletal ATP consumption, high respirations, and high heart rates in this case. Now, there is a consequence of burning through a lot of glucose. What happens, folks, is then you deplete your stored glucose, and eventually, if you deplete your stored glucose, what's going to happen, folks, is you're going to start burning through fatty acids, right? Because you can also utilize fatty acids for beta oxidation for creation of ATP. And you're going to start breaking amino acids because amino acids can also enter, in this case, the metabolic pathway to create more ATP. Okay, so here you can read through like the systemic effects. One of the consequences as well is you will not store glycogen, right? Because you're burning through glucose, you don't have enough glucose, you will not have enough glucose left over to be stored. Okay, but the way this works, folks, is so one of the ways that you actually increase increase metabolic rate is there's a stimulus. The stimulus here, folks, is again cold weather. Why do you need more calories in cold weather? This is one of the reasons why we gain weight during the winter time, right? Pregnancy, why? Well, obviously you need to supply energy for your child, okay, for the person inside you. High altitude, because you'll have high difficulty. In this case, you're going to have difficulty breathing, and obviously hypoglycemia. If you have low blood sugar, obviously this also kicks in. But the way this works is once the stimulus is actually sensed by your hypothalamus, it releases, in this case, what does it release? Thyroid releasing hormone. The thyroid releasing hormone in turn stimulates the anterior pituitary to secrete thyroid stimulating hormone, which in turn stimulates the thyroid gland to secrete thyroid hormone, which is either T3 or T4. And then thyroid hormone then will have this multiple effects that I've covered before. So note again, like previously, this secretion, this high amounts of circulating thyroid hormone then shuts off the two upstream organs above it. It shuts off the pituitary from releasing more TSH. It also turns off the hypothalamus from releasing more TRH. And so this is negatively feedbacked at that point. Okay. Another example is the cortisol hormone. Cortisol hormone, folks, is the stress hormone. Okay, so this is again caused by stress. This is also, as you can see, the actual stimulus for this is the time of the day. I don't know if you guys notice, during the early times, you get up, you're ready to go, you actually have higher amounts of cortisol, and then obviously, like as the day goes on, the amounts of cortisol actually gets decreased because why? You don't need to go become active at later parts of night. Okay, but the effects of that is similar to thyroid hormone. What you do, folks, is you burn a lot more calories. So there's a similarity here between thyroid hormone and cortisol hormone. Cortisol hormone makes you burn through a lot of calories. And why is that? One of the stressors is, let's say in the olden days, in like during our predecessors, in this case our ancestors, in this case the cavemen, it is more than likely that they're being chased by animals all over the place, right? So what happens is you need ATP to run away from someone, from something, in order for you to survive. Okay, so your body says, okay, we need to consume a lot of ATP because we need a lot of energy running away, fighting something, and getting frightened. So all of those three things together burns a lot of ATP. All right. So again, the way that works, folks, is the hypothalamus again senses stress, right? Okay, and the time of day, and what happens, folks, is that stress. And FYI, what stress is that? That's the sympathetic pathway. This is actually the sympathetic pathway. It stimulates, in this case, the anterior pituitary, okay, to release ACTH. ACTH stimulates the adrenal glands to create cortisol, and then cortisol again creates a lot of effects, and most of those effects are, in this case, the manufacture of a lot of ATPs. Okay, now I don't know if you know this. If you have high stress levels all the time, now if you're burning through a lot of ATP, you might think, oh, that means you're gonna get skinny, right? Yes. In some effects, stress is only meant to be short term. So when you are short term stressed, you will lose calories and you will lose weight. But what happens, folks, is if this is a long term stress, let's say this is weeks, months. Okay, let's say, you know, like you have a stressful, like you live in somewhere dangerous. Okay, so you're constantly stressed day and night, 24/7, obviously 7 days a week. What happens, folks, is normally ACTH, right, that stimulates cortisol, again, the high amounts of cortisol normally shuts off the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus, correct? From hypothalamus from secreting corticotropin releasing hormone and adrenocorticotropic hormone. The problem is, if you have all the time high amounts of cortisol, the receptors for cortisol in the pituitary and the hypothalamus basically gets down-regulated. That means they become less. So what happens is you will no longer, your hypothalamus then in this case and your pituitary gland then will no longer listen to the negative feedback. And because of this, high amounts of cortisol then, what happens is then your body then starts actually in this case negating the effects of cortisol at that point. Okay, so there is a bad side effects for, in this case, undue amounts of stress for extended periods of time. And this is actually what this is. This is called the general adaptation syndrome. If there's a stress, what happens is you actually get an initial shock. This is actually what happens when you, let's say, you have an accident. If you ever had a car accident or you've ever been in a fight, the first thing that happens is you actually have this sudden downward, decreased respirations, decreased mental status. It's the shock. Then your body kicks into gear and starts to protect you, in this case creating molecules and creating calories for you to fight the stress. Right? However, the way that this goes supposed to be is eventually this stress is supposed to go away and you're supposed to go back to normal, and the amounts of cortisol goes back to normal. If the amounts of cortisol, folks, keeps going up, what happens, folks, is then your body starts obviously burning through calories. Your body then becomes ill, and one of the reasons why you become ill, folks, is cortisol is actually an immunosuppressant. You guys know this. If you've taken prednisone, you've taken inhalers. Inhalers are actually primarily, in this case, steroids. So cortisol is actually a steroid. What happens, folks, is you actually become ill. It's an immunosuppressant, right? And eventually, if that happens for long periods of time, obviously death occurs. Okay, so very, very important here. So you don't want to be stressed all the time. Okay, and that's why we need to have some coping mechanisms to actually remove the stress. The other problem that we have now in the modern age, folks, in the modern era, is our stressors are sometimes imaginary. In the era of the cave movement, the stressors are real, right? Like a saber-toothed tiger chases you down, but eventually the saber-toothed tiger goes away. Correct? Now, what happens, folks, is if you live in this era in which we're constantly bombarded by the negative news, right? Or we have a stalker, or in social media, or like in this case, or we live in areas in which the crime is high. What happens, folks, also those stressors then become, even though it might not be affecting us directly, we assume that there's stress all the time and our body reacts the same way reacts to us. Okay? That's why, and also, folks, again, sleeping. Sleeping is also one very, very good way for you to actually, in this case, relieve stress. Sleeping. Okay? What you don't want to do when you get stressed is you actually go and work out more, because working out more actually, in this case, creates more stress for your body. Okay? So very, very important. So in this endocrine system video, I want you guys to, again, to focus on, in this case, this feedback loop. Please make sure that you understand what the effects are, what the negative, again, know that the organ and the hormone downstream always turns off normally the organ and the hormone upstream. So the anterior pituitary shuts off the hypothalamus. Okay? The target gland, in this case, the thyroid, the adrenal glands, whatever that would be, turns off both the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. Okay, so make sure that you understand how this feedback operates.